The wind carried the scent of rain over the rolling plains, whispering to the tall grass like voices of spirits long forgotten. Ayoka knelt by the riverbank, her slender fingers grazing the cool surface of the water as she collected herbs in a small woven pouch. The evening sun painted the sky in hues of fire and gold, casting her world in an amber glow. She loved this time of day, when the land stretched out endlessly, untouched and eternal. It made her feel safe. But that safety was an illusion. A distant cry of a hawk made her pause. She glanced toward the horizon where smoke from her village's fires curled lazily into the sky. A deep unease prickled her skin, an instinct she couldn't shake. Something was wrong. Ayoka gathered her things and rose quickly, her moccasins soundless against the earth as she hurried back toward her people's camp. The rhythmic pounding of hooves in the distance made her heartbeat quicken. The men should not be riding in so fast at this hour. She crested the last hill and froze. Her people stood in a tight cluster near the central fire, their faces drawn with something between fear and grief. Her mother, Whoppin, was on her knees, her head bowed, shoulders trembling as she clutched at the hem of a man's buckskin coat. That man was Honto, Ayoka's father. But the man she had known, the strong warrior who once sang to her beneath the stars, was gone. In his place stood a hollowed-out version of himself, his face lined with desperation, his eyes dark with shame. Ayoka took a step forward, her breath unsteady. The sharp scent of sweat and whiskey stung her nose as she noticed the strangers standing beside him. 5 men, hard-faced, sunburned, dressed in dust-covered leather and wide-brimmed hats. White men, armed men. The leader stood in front of her father, his hand resting lazily on the revolver strapped to his hip. His face was lined with deep scars, his hair wild, his eyes a piercing blue that held nothing human. His voice, when he spoke, was like the rasp of a whetstone against steel. This the girl? Ayoka felt the air leave her lungs. Honto gave a slight nod, unable to meet her gaze. Her stomach twisted. "What is this?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. No one answered. The leader, Jed Tate, turned toward her fully now, his grin a jagged slash across his face. "Well now, ain't she a pretty thing?" he drawled, taking a step closer. "You'll do just fine." Ayoka recoiled, her pulse pounding in her ears. She looked at her father, confusion turning to dread. "Father?" His mouth opened, but no words came. The silence was worse than an answer. Then her mother screamed. Whoppin lunged for Honto, fists pounding against his chest as she wailed, grief and fury twisting her face into something unrecognizable. "You swore," she choked. "You swore to protect her." Honto only stood there, letting the blows rain down, unresisting. Ayoka took a step back, every muscle screaming at her to run, but hands seized her arms before she could move. Rough, unyielding, she fought, twisting and kicking, but the outlaws were stronger. One of them yanked her braid, jerking her head back, his breath foul against her cheek. "She's a wild one," he muttered. She screamed. Her people stirred, uneasy, but none moved. The men stood stiff and still, their faces carved from stone. They had seen what happened to those who defied men like these. Jed Tate pulled a coin from his pocket and tossed it to Honto, who caught it with shaking hands. "Pleasure doing business with you," Jed said, voice laced with mockery. Ayoka's blood ran cold. "Business," she thrashed, her fury giving her strength, but another set of hands gripped her tighter, bruising her skin. "Let me go," she spat, kicking wildly, nails clawing for any flesh she could reach. Jed only laughed. "She's got fire. I like that. You can't do this." Ayoka cried, her voice cracking with desperation. "I am not cattle to be traded." Jed crouched in front of her, his grin widening. "No, little doe," he murmured. "You're something much more valuable." Ayoka turned to Honto, pleading, "Please." But he only turned away. Something inside her shattered. The outlaws dragged her toward the waiting horses. She kicked, screaming her mother's name, but her cries were lost in the evening wind. Whoppin tried to run after her, but a firm hand grabbed her, holding her back. Ayoka fought until her limbs ached, until her voice was raw. But in the end, the men were stronger. They threw her over the back of a horse, tying her wrists as if she were nothing more than a captured animal. Jed swung onto his saddle, his boots creaking against the stirrups. "Let's ride," he called. The outlaws turned their horses, spurring them forward, kicking up dust as they thundered out of the village. Ayoka lifted her head, her hair whipping around her face as she looked back. Her people grew smaller, their figures lost in the swirling dusk. No one followed. No one came for her. She was alone. The ride was brutal. Her body jolted with every hoofbeat, the ropes cutting into her wrists, but she gritted her teeth and held on. She would not break. The sun dipped below the horizon, the sky darkening as the land stretched into endless miles of wilderness. The outlaw camp lay deep in the Badlands, hidden where no law reached, where no justice existed. Hours passed. Her muscles screamed in protest, but she refused to cry. Jed's men laughed and spoke in low voices, their words ugly and filled with promises she refused to think about. Jed himself rode ahead, silent, but Ayoka could feel his presence like a vulture circling a dying creature. Finally, they reached the camp. A ragged collection of tents and fire pits lay sprawled beneath the shadow of the cliffs. The scent of unwashed bodies, whiskey, and smoke filled the air. Jed dismounted first, stretching lazily. He turned, eyes glinting as he approached. One of the men yanked Ayoka from the horse, shoving her forward. She stumbled, but stayed upright. Jed studied her for a long moment, then reached out and traced a rough finger down her cheek. Ayoka flinched. "I like M. Wild," he murmured. "Gives me something to break." Ayoka met his gaze, her eyes burning with hatred. "You will regret this," she whispered. Jed chuckled, shaking his head. "I doubt that." With a snap of his fingers, two men grabbed her and dragged her toward a tent at the edge of the camp. The night swallowed her scream. The night stretched over the outlaw camp like a vast, suffocating shroud. Smoke curled from the dying embers of the fire pits, carrying the scent of whiskey, sweat, and something more insidious, violence waiting to unfold. The men had spent the evening drinking, their laughter crude, their voices slurred with liquor. Some had passed out near the fire, boots still on, guns within easy reach. Others huddled in groups, murmuring over stolen goods and dark deals yet to be made. Inside a small tent, Ayoka sat with her arms bound, her wrists rubbed raw from struggling against the rough rope. Her breathing was slow, measured, not from acceptance, but from a refusal to let fear consume her. She had learned in one brutal night that these men thrived on fear, fed on it like wolves drawn to the scent of a wounded deer. She would not give them the satisfaction. A flap of the tent stirred. Jed's silhouette loomed, framed by flickering firelight. He stepped inside, moving with the confidence of a man who had never known a world where he did not hold power. His gaze slid over her, assessing, enjoying the helplessness he believed her to be drowning in. Ayoka refused to cower. Her eyes met his with a fire that had not dimmed. "You can keep staring at me like that," Jed mused, kneeling beside her, "but it won't change what you are now." She clenched her fists, nails biting into her palms. "And what is that?" she whispered. Jed grinned. "Mine." Before he could say more, a sharp, piercing whistle split the air outside the tent. Jed stiffened. His hand went to his revolver in an instant, his grin vanishing. The sound came again, high and shrill, a signal, but not one of his own. Then a scream. It was short, brutal, cut off too soon. Jed rose, his body tense. "Stay put," he muttered before ducking out into the night. Ayoka's heart pounded. She shifted, angling herself to peer through the slit in the tent fabric. Shadows moved outside, quick, fluid. One by one, the outlaws began to stir, hands grasping at weapons, heads snapping toward the darkness beyond their campfire's glow. Another cry, then silence. The men exchanged uneasy glances. Jed turned toward his second-in-command, a stocky man with a scar running down his jaw. "Light the torches. Find out what's out there." Scarjaw nodded and barked an order. The men fanned out, torches flaring to life, their flickering glow pushing against the thick dark. Then, from the blackness of the tree line, a figure emerged. He walked as if he were part of the night itself, silent, his steps measured, the long rifle resting in his hands barely shifting with his movements. He was Cheyenne. Tusunka, his name carried whispers in every outlaw den, in every frontier town where men spoke in low voices of the one who still fought, who still hunted those who thought themselves above justice. Some call him a ghost. Others called him the last true warrior. Ayoka knew him only as a legend. And now he was here. His eyes, dark and unreadable, flicked over the outlaws as if counting each one, as if already measuring the battle before it began. He did not speak. Jed let out a slow breath, shaking his head. "I know you," he said. "Silent Wolf." Tusunka did not respond. His gaze landed on Ayoka's tent, a flicker of recognition passing through his otherwise impassive face. Jed sighed, rolling his shoulders. "Don't suppose you came to trade?" Still no answer. Jed's fingers twitched at his holster. "Then I suppose we—" A gunshot rang out, not from Jed's revolver. Tusunka had fired first. The man nearest him crumpled, a hole between his eyes before his body hit the ground. Then everything exploded into chaos. The outlaws scrambled, guns drawn, but Tusunka was already moving. His rifle cracked again, and another man fell. He weaved through the confusion, ducking low, reloading with practiced ease. A knife flashed in his hand, and before one of Jed's men could bring his weapon to bear, the blade buried itself deep in his throat. Ayoka's breath caught. He was faster than them, stronger. He did not hesitate. The men who had once laughed so boldly now shouted in fear, firing wildly into the dark. Jed cursed, taking cover behind a wooden crate, fury twisting his face. "Kill him, you damn fools." But they couldn't. Tusunka moved like a shadow, striking, retreating, reappearing in another place before another outlaw could even turn. Ayoka struggled against her bindings, teeth grinding as the rope burned against her skin. The commotion outside was deafening. Gunfire, grunts of pain, bodies hitting the ground. Then, through the chaos, she saw Jed disappear into the darkness. Coward. The ropes finally gave way. She worked quickly, rubbing her raw wrists before slipping out of the tent. The camp was in ruin. Bodies littered the ground, firelight casting long shadows over the dead and dying. Tusunka stood among them, unmoving, his expression unreadable. He turned as she stepped forward. Their eyes met, and in that moment she understood he had not come here by accident. He had come for her. A scream of rage cut through the night. "Jed!" He burst from the darkness, his revolver already raised, his finger on the trigger. Tusunka lunged. A single shot rang out. Ayoka's breath hitched as Jed staggered, his face contorting in shock. His gun fell from his fingers, hitting the dirt with a dull thud. He turned, eyes wide, searching for the source of the bullet buried in his chest. Not Tusunka. Ayoka still held the smoking revolver in her shaking hands. Jed's knees buckled. He let out a weak, gasping laugh before crumpling forward, his blood staining the earth beneath him. Silence. Tusunka stepped toward her. "Are you hurt?" His voice was deeper than she expected, rough like distant thunder. Ayoka shook her head. "No." He nodded. "We leave. Now." She didn't hesitate. They moved quickly, stepping over bodies, past the smoldering remnants of the camp. The night air was thick with the scent of blood and smoke. Tusunka led her to a horse, lifting her easily onto its back before swinging up behind her. He did not ask if she wished to stay. She did not look back. As they rode into the night, Ayoka felt something unfamiliar rise within her. For the first time since she had been stolen from her home. Hope. The moon hung high, casting a pale light over the rugged wilderness. The cold wind whispered to the trees, carrying the scent of wet earth and pine. Ayoka clung to the horse as they rode deeper into the forest, the rhythm of its hooves pounding steadily against the earth beneath her. She glanced back, but the outlaw camp was already a distant shadow, swallowed by the vastness of the night. The ride had been long, and fatigue weighed heavy on her, but the fear that clung to her like a second skin began to fade as the hours passed. She had fought so hard to stay alive, to keep from being consumed by hopelessness. But with every mile they covered, the burden that had suffocated her chest slowly loosened. She wasn't running from the past anymore. She was riding towards something different, something unknown. The warrior who rode beside her was an enigma, silent as the moon itself, but she could feel the steady presence of him at her back. Tasunka had not spoken since they had left the camp, and she wondered about the man who had saved her. Who was he, truly? They reached a small clearing by the edge of the stream, the sound of rushing water filling the air with its soothing murmur. Tasunka dismounted and tied the horse to a nearby tree before turning to her. Rest. Ayoka slid from the saddle, her body stiff from the long ride, but she did not protest. She could feel her muscles aching, but something within her urged her to keep moving. She had to be strong. She couldn't afford to let fear and weakness take root. Tasunka set up a small fire, the crackle of the flames adding to the night symphony. Ayoka sat cross-legged on the ground, watching him work. His movements were precise, efficient. He did not waste time. There was a quiet strength to him, an air of confidence that did not need to announce itself. He wasn't the type of man who would offer explanations or ask for them in return. She thought about her own life, her family, her people, the dream she once held of a future filled with laughter and love, of sharing stories around the fire, of walking through the plains with the wind in her hair. But all that had been torn away, shattered in a single night. "I am not a child," she said quietly, her voice breaking the silence that hung between them. Tasunka paused, his back to her as he tended to the fire. He did not turn to face her, but his voice, when it came, was steady. "You are not a prisoner anymore." Ayoka swallowed, her throat tight. "I am not what they said I was." "I know," he said simply. She felt a flicker of something, a connection, though she didn't understand it. In the silence of the night, as they sat together, she began to realize that this warrior was not like the men who had taken her. He didn't seek to control her, to break her spirit. He didn't see her as a possession. He had freed her without asking for anything in return. Tasunka finished preparing their food, handing her a small portion of dried meat and berries. They ate in silence, the crackle of the fire the only sound between them. The night stretched on, heavy with the weight of unspoken words. Ayoka's thoughts drifted back to her father. She could still feel the sting of his betrayal, the helplessness that had consumed her when she had seen him hand her over to those men. Her hands clenched into fists as anger surged within her, a fierce storm that threatened to overwhelm her. But she forced it down, swallowing the bitterness that burned in her chest. "Why did you come for me?" she asked, her voice soft but insistent. "You could have left me." Tasunka's gaze shifted to her, and for the first time, she saw something other than the cold resolve of his eyes. There was a flicker of something deeper, something he kept buried beneath layers of silence and stoic composure. "I did not come for you," he said quietly. "I came for justice." Ayoka met his gaze, confused. "Justice?" He nodded. "They took what was not theirs. I am not the law, but there are some things even outlaws must answer for." The words hung in the air between them. She thought about the men who had stolen her, who had thought they could sell her as if she were a thing. And now she was free. But was she? The fire crackled as they sat in the stillness. She could feel the tension in the air between them, like an invisible thread that bound them together. It was not a bond forged in trust or shared history, but one formed in the crucible of survival. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked suddenly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Leaving your people, leaving everything behind to fight alone?" Tasunka didn't answer immediately. He stared into the flames, his face lit by the dancing light, his features hard but unreadable. After a long moment, he finally spoke. "No." His voice was quiet, resolute. "There are things worth fighting for, Ayoka, things that do not die." She felt the weight of his words settle in her chest. There was so much she didn't understand, so much that had been taken from her. But in that moment, as they sat beneath the stars, she realized something. The world had never been kind. And yet, despite everything, there was a quiet strength in her that refused to be broken. They both looked up as the sound of a distant howl broke the stillness. A wolf's cry, lonely and haunting, echoing through the forest. Tasunka rose from his place by the fire, moving with the fluidity of a predator. Ayoka watched him, a part of her unsettled by the rawness of his presence, the force of his being. "We need to move," he said, his voice steady, commanding. Ayoka stood, dusting the dirt from her legs. She didn't question him. They gathered their things and set out again, this time with a purpose more urgent. The fire behind them flickered, casting long shadows into the trees. Hours passed in silence as they made their way through the dense forest, their horses picking their way carefully over the uneven ground. The moon was higher now, illuminating the path ahead. Then, as dawn began to break, a sharp crack echoed through the woods. Tasunka's hand flew to the hilt of his knife, his body tense. Ayoka's heart raced, and she instinctively moved closer to him. From the trees ahead, figures emerged, silhouettes, dark against the faint light of dawn. "Outlaws," Tasunka muttered, his voice low, filled with barely contained anger. Ayoka's pulse quickened. Her eyes widened in recognition as the men approached. They had found them. The time for running was over. Tasunka drew his blade, the steel catching the first light of the day. His movements were swift, deliberate. There was no hesitation in him. Ayoka reached for the revolver at her waist, her hand steady despite the fear curling in her gut. The outlaws advanced, unaware of the storm that was about to hit them. And then, in a flash of motion, the first man went down. The rest followed quickly, falling like wheat to a scythe. Ayoka fired her shot with precision, watching the man crumple before he could raise his rifle. The battle raged for mere moments before it was over. When the dust settled, only Tasunka and Ayoka remained standing, their bodies heaving with the intensity of the fight. Tasunka turned toward her, his eyes meeting hers. And for the first time since they had met, something passed between them, an understanding. "Are you with me now?" he asked, his voice quiet but fierce. Ayoka met his gaze, the weight of her decision heavy on her shoulders. She thought of her past, of the life that had been stolen from her, and then she thought of the warrior who had given her a chance to stand. "I am with you," she said. And in that moment, the bond between them was sealed. They would survive. Together. The dusty town of Red Hollow simmered under the dying sun, its streets thick with the restless energy of men who lived and died by the gun. The Silver Spur Saloon stood at its center, like a throbbing heart, pulsing with music, laughter, and the clinking of whiskey glasses. Inside, cigar smoke curled toward the rafters, mixing with the scent of sweat and spilled liquor. At a corner table, men huddled over a game of poker, their voices low and wary. Near the bar, a drunk swayed, mumbling curses at the barkeep who refused to pour him another round. And in the eye of the storm, moving between tables with the effortless grace of someone who had learned to survive in places like this, was Evelyn Ray. Her dress, a deep shade of emerald, clung to her curves just enough to draw attention, but her movements carried a quiet efficiency. She knew how to flash a smile at the right man, how to step just beyond the reach of a grabby hand, how to navigate the treacherous world of men who saw her as something to be owned. But there was always an undercurrent to her, something too guarded, too sharp in her eyes, as if she had already measured every exit in the room. Tonight, though, she was slipping. Her fingers trembled when she placed a whiskey glass in front of a grizzled rancher, and her smile faltered when a man's rough fingers brushed her wrist. She recovered quickly, but not before a pair of keen eyes caught the moment. Jonas Callahan leaned against the far wall, his hat tipped low, watching. He had seen fear in men before, had seen it drive them to desperate things. He had no interest in whatever trouble she was drowning in, until the saloon doors swung open and trouble walked in. 3 men entered, their spurs jingling with every step. Dust clung to them like they had ridden hard and fast to get here, and their eyes carried the dead look of men who had spilled too much blood to ever find peace again. The leader, a lean man with the shadow of a beard and a scar bisecting his left eyebrow, swept his gaze across the room before settling on Evelyn. She felt the weight of it immediately. A chill crawled up her spine. She turned her back and moved toward the bar, but she had already given too much away. Jonas straightened. The tension in the room shifted, subtle but unmistakable. The gamblers quieted. The barkeep hesitated mid-pour, and the drunk near the bar suddenly found enough sense to stumble toward the door. The scarred man strode forward, his boot heels clicking against the wooden floor. "Miss Ray," he drawled, his voice carrying just enough civility to mask the threat beneath. "Been a long time." Evelyn didn't turn. She reached for a bottle, but her fingers slipped against the glass. "I don't know you," she said, her voice steady but brittle. The man chuckled, slow and humorless. "Now, that ain't true. We got unfinished business. And I don't much like loose ends." Jonas exhaled slowly. He had seen this play before. A woman cornered, a man closing in, sure of his power, and a room full of people too scared or too indifferent to intervene. He pushed away from the wall. "You fellas look like you've had a long ride," he said, stepping into the space between them. "Maybe a drink would smooth out whatever grievance you've got." The scarred man turned, finally noticing him. His eyes flicked over Jonas, weighing him. "Mind your own, bounty hunter." Jonas lifted his glass. "See, I would, but I got this peculiar itch that don't sit right when a man talks to a lady with his hand too close to his belt." The air thickened. Every man in the room felt the shift, the inevitable tilt toward violence. The piano player stopped mid-note, slipping quietly from his bench. The barkeep ducked behind the bar, pretending to polish a glass, but positioning himself near the shotgun beneath the counter. Evelyn saw the moment before it happened. The scarred man's fingers twitched, a barely perceptible motion, but one Jonas had seen too many times before. The gunfight was over before it started. Jonas moved first. His revolver cleared leather in a smooth, practiced motion, the first shot splitting the silence like a whip crack. The scarred man's body jerked back, his gun clattering to the floor. His men reacted a second too late. Jonas fired again, dropping the second before he could draw. The third turned to run, but shot from Evelyn's direction made him think twice. He hesitated long enough for Jonas to close the gap and slam the butt of his gun into the man's temple. Silence settled like dust after a storm. Blood pooled beneath the scarred man's body, the smell of gunpowder sharp in the air. Jonas reloaded calmly, glancing around the room. The patrons stared wide-eyed, pressing themselves against the walls, not daring to move. Evelyn's hands shook as she lowered the pistol. She had fired, hadn't even thought about it. She didn't know if she had hit anything, but it didn't matter. The weight of what almost happened, of what still might, pressed on her like a vice. Jonas holstered his gun and turned to her. "Pack a bag." She blinked. "What?" "You just made enemies," he said, voice low, measured. "They'll come looking for payback. You leave now, you might have a head start." Her breath came fast. She looked down at the men on the floor. The scarred one's dead eyes stared at her, unseeing. The last time she had seen those eyes, they had promised to find her. She swallowed hard. "I don't even know where to go." Jonas studied her for a long moment, then reached into his pocket and pulled out a set of silver coins, sliding them onto the bar. "You got 1 minute to decide, lady. Either you ride with me, or you figure out alone." She hesitated. The air in the saloon pressed in, thick with too many watching eyes. She could feel the weight of the decision settling in her bones. And then she nodded. "I'll go." Jonas gave a single nod, then turned and strode toward the door. Evelyn followed, her steps quick, her pulse hammering. As they stepped into the night, the town of Red Hollow swallowed them, and the chase began. The desert swallowed them whole. The moment they rode out of Red Hollow, the town disappeared behind them, nothing more than a flickering memory against the black horizon. The moon hung high, casting long shadows that slithered across the cracked earth. Evelyn gripped the reins of her borrowed horse, her fingers white-knuckled against the leather. She had barely managed to throw a satchel over her shoulder before they left, carrying nothing but a change of clothes and whatever money she had hidden away. Her breath still came fast, her heart pounding against her ribs like a war drum. The weight of what had just happened clung to her skin, thick as the dust that coated her boots. Jonas rode ahead, his posture straight, his movements fluid. He rode like a man who had spent more time in the saddle than on solid ground. Every so often, he would glance back at her, his face unreadable beneath the brim of his hat. He hadn't said a word since they left, hadn't asked her if she was all right, if she regretted following him. She was grateful for that. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the rhythmic pounding of hooves against dirt. The cool night air pressed against her skin, soothing the heat of panic that still lingered in her chest. She forced herself to breathe, to focus on the movement of the horse beneath her, the steady sway that reminded her she was still alive, still moving forward. But forward to where? She didn't know this man. She knew of him, knew his name carried weight in places where the law was little more than a suggestion. Jonas Callahan was a bounty hunter, a man whose reputation preceded him like the wind before a storm. He was known for tracking down the worst kind of men, for dragging them back, dead or alive, though more often than not, it was the former. And now, he was her only chance at surviving the night. A shiver ran through her, though it had nothing to do with the cold. She swallowed hard, finally finding her voice. "Where are we going?" she asked, surprised by how steady she sounded. Jonas didn't turn his head. "Somewhere you ain't dead by morning." Not exactly the reassurance she was hoping for. She adjusted her grip on the reins. "I should thank you." "You should stay quiet," he said evenly. "The less you talk, the harder it is for someone to follow your voice." Her lips pressed into a thin line. "And if I don't?" He sighed, finally looking at her. His gaze was sharp, assessing. "Then I start wondering if I made a mistake bringing you along." She bristled but bit back the sharp reply waiting on her tongue. She had seen the way he moved, the way he had handled those men back at the saloon. He wasn't the kind of man you argued with unless you were sure you could win. And right now, she wasn't sure of anything. So she fell silent. The night stretched on, the desert stretching endlessly before them. Jonas led them through winding trails, cutting through rocky hills and dry riverbeds, following paths Evelyn could barely make out even with the moonlight. He knew this land, moved through it like a shadow slipping between the cracks. After what felt like hours, he finally slowed his horse. "We stop here." Evelyn reined in her horse, glancing around. There was nothing but sand and scattered brush, a few jagged rocks jutting from the ground like the bones of some ancient creature. "This is your idea of a safe place?" she asked. Jonas dismounted, tying his horse to a low-hanging branch. "Safe don't mean comfortable." She sighed, swinging her leg over the saddle and sliding to the ground. Her legs ached from the ride, her muscles stiff and uncooperative. Jonas pulled his saddlebag free, rummaging through it before tossing her a small canteen. "Drink." She caught it, unscrewing the cap and taking a long sip. The water was lukewarm but soothing. "You planning on telling me why those men were after you?" he asked. Her grip on the canteen tightened. She had known this was coming, had known from the moment she stepped into the night with him that she would have to tell the truth, but speaking out loud made it real. She sank onto a nearby rock, exhaling slowly. "His name is Marshal David Slade." Jonas stilled. The firelight cast deep shadows across his face, but she caught the flicker of recognition in his eyes. "I know that name," he said. "Been hearing it more and more lately. Rumors about a U.S. Marshal turning outlaw." "Not rumors," she murmured. "Truth." Jonas didn't speak, waiting. Evelyn ran a hand through her hair, fingers tangling in the loose curls. "He came into Red Hollow months ago. Had that badge, that easy smile. People trusted him. He had that kind of presence, the kind that made men listen, made women believe he was the sort of man who could keep them safe." She scoffed, shaking her head. But then people started disappearing. Ranch hands, drifters, no one important enough to raise an alarm. No one who had family close enough to ask questions. Jonas's jaw tightened. "And you figured it out." "I didn't mean to," she admitted. "I walked in on him and his men. Saw them hauling some poor soul out behind the saloon. Slade caught me before I could run." Jonas's expression darkened. "What happened?" Her throat tightened. He smiled. "Told me I'd forget what I saw. That women like me weren't meant for knowing things. Then he put a gun to my head." She swallowed hard, her fingers digging into her palms. "I thought I was dead, but instead he let me go." Jonas studied her. "And you stayed quiet." She let out a bitter laugh. "What choice did I have? A saloon girl against a U.S. Marshal? Even if I ran, where would I go? But then one of his men got drunk. Started talking too much. I wrote it all down. Names, places, everything." Jonas nodded, understanding. And now he wants you dead. She looked up at him, her eyes fierce despite the fear lingering beneath. I don't need you to save me, bounty hunter. I just need to stay alive long enough to make sure he hangs. Jonas held her gaze for a long moment. Then he nodded. We ride at dawn. Evelyn exhaled, the weight on her chest easing just enough for her to breathe. But as she lay back against the hard earth, staring up at the endless sky, she knew there was no peace to be found, because morning would bring the hunt. The sun bled into the horizon, casting the desert in streaks of gold and crimson. The wind had shifted, carrying with it the scent of something distant and dangerous. Jonas had been awake long before dawn, sitting by the dying embers of the fire, listening. The stillness of the desert was deceptive. Silence never meant safety. It meant something was waiting. Evelyn stirred beside him, stretching sore limbs as she pushed herself up on her elbows. Sleep had been fitful, and it showed in the weary set of her eyes. But there was something else there, too, something sharper. Fear, yes, but no longer the kind that left a person paralyzed. The woman who had left Red Hollow in a rush of panic had been replaced by someone who had seen the edge of the abyss and chosen to keep walking. Jonas glanced at her as she brushed dust from her dress. You ride as soon as I give the word, he said, voice low. She looked at him, frowning. And leave you here alone? You don't owe me a fight, lady. Her lips pressed together. Maybe not, but I owe him one. Jonas exhaled, watching her. She wasn't just running anymore. She was looking for something. Retribution. Resolution. Something that couldn't be found in flight. Before he could answer, a distant sound cut through the wind. Hoofbeats. Slow, steady, methodical. They had found them. Jonas stood, drawing his gun, his body moving with the ease of a man who had faced death too many times to count. Evelyn followed his gaze, her fingers brushing the grip of the pistol tucked into her belt. She had never been a fighter, but desperation had a way of turning people into things they never thought they'd become. The riders crested the ridge, silhouettes against the rising sun. 4 of them. The man leading them sat tall in the saddle, his hat tilted just enough to shadow his face. But Evelyn didn't need to see him to know who he was. Marshal David Slade. His voice carried across the distance, smooth as oil. You made me come a long way, sweetheart. Jonas stepped forward, his gun loose in his grip. Turn that horse around, Slade. Slade laughed. And here? I thought you of all people would appreciate the hunt. I gotta say, Callahan, you're making a mess of my business. Jonas's jaw tightened. You don't got a business, Marshal. You got a noose waiting for you. Slade's smile didn't waver, but his grip on the reins tightened. See, that's the trouble with men like you. You believe in things that don't exist. Justice. Fair trials. His gaze slid to Evelyn, sharp and gleaming. That's not how this ends. Evelyn felt her breath hitch. She knew how men like Slade worked. He wasn't here to bring her back. He was here to make sure she never spoke another word. Jonas tilted his head, glancing at her before shifting his weight slightly, positioning himself between her and the men on horseback. Reckon you got one chance to ride away, Slade, he said evenly, or we finish this right here. Slade's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. He was sizing Jonas up, trying to decide if the risk was worth it. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, he reached for his gun. Jonas moved first. The shot split the morning air, cracking like a whip. Slade's hat flew off as he jerked sideways, barely twisting out of the bullet's path. His men scattered, drawing their weapons as a fight erupted in a blur of dust and gunfire. Evelyn dropped low, pressing herself against the nearest boulder. Her pulse roared in her ears, her breath coming fast. She gripped her pistol with both hands, forcing her shaking fingers to stay steady. Jonas was already moving, firing off shots with the precision of a man who had spent his life living between the squeeze of a trigger. One of Slade's men went down, clutching his chest as he tumbled from the saddle. Another fired back, missing by inches as Jonas rolled into cover. Evelyn saw Slade circling, his eyes locked on Jonas. He wasn't just here to kill her anymore. Now, it was about something else. Dominance. Pride. Slade had lived his whole life above the law, bending it to his will. A man like him wouldn't accept losing. Jonas stepped out from behind cover, firing another shot. It hit Slade's shoulder, sending him reeling, but the marshal gritted his teeth and stayed in the saddle. Blood darkened his coat, but he didn't slow. Then Evelyn saw it, one of Slade's men flanking Jonas from behind, raising his gun. She didn't think. She fired. The bullet struck the man square in the chest, the force knocking him back against his horse. He slumped, his gun falling from his grip. Jonas spun, his eyes flicking to her for the briefest second. A small nod, a silent acknowledgement. Then Slade charged. He came down from his horse, tackling Jonas aground, the two men rolling in a violent blur of fists and fury. The gun slipped from Jonas's hand, landing a few feet away in the dirt. Evelyn's breath caught as Slade pinned Jonas, his face twisted with something primal. "You think you're different than me," he hissed. "You think you ain't just another killer?" Jonas gritted his teeth, shoving against him. "Difference is, I know what I am." Then, with a sharp twist, Jonas drove his elbow into Slade's side, throwing him off balance just enough to shove him away. Evelyn didn't hesitate. She raised her pistol, aiming square at Slade's chest. He looked at her, breathing hard. Blood trickled from the cut on his temple, but he still held himself like a man who thought he could talk his way out of anything. "Go on then," he said, voice low. "Finish it." Evelyn's hand shook. Every instinct screamed at her to pull the trigger, to end it. But something deep inside her refused. She wasn't him. She wasn't Slade. Her jaw tightened. No. Then Jonas moved. He grabbed his gun, flipping it in his grip before bringing the barrel down hard against the side of Slade's head. The marshal crumpled, unconscious. Silence settled over the desert, thick and heavy. Jonas exhaled, rolling his shoulder as he stood. He glanced down at Slade's motionless body before looking at Evelyn. "You all right?" She nodded, though she wasn't sure it was the truth. "He's alive." "Yeah," Jonas said, rubbing his jaw. Figured he ought to know what it feels like to lose. Evelyn let out a shaky breath, the tension in her limbs finally loosening. They tied Slade to his horse, securing him for the long ride back. The remaining rider had fled, leaving them alone in the empty stretch of desert. As they mounted up, Evelyn looked over at Jonas. "You ever think about stopping?" she asked. "The bounty hunting?" Jonas adjusted his reins, watching the sun climb higher. "Don't rightly know what I'd do if I did." She nodded slowly, as if she understood that better than she wanted to admit. As they rode toward the horizon, she realized something. For the first time in a long while, she wasn't running. She was chasing something new. The year was 1865. The war had ended, but the scars ran deep. Towns smoldered in the east, their streets littered with shattered glass and broken dreams. Men returned home, their hands still shaking from the weight of rifles, only to find their fields overgrown and their families thinner than they remembered. Hope was a currency most could no longer afford. But out west, the land remained wild, untamed, and indifferent to the suffering of men. It was a place of risk, of ruin, but also of reinvention. And for some, that promise was worth everything. Rebecca tightened her grip on the reins, her knuckles paling as the wind tugged at her shawl. The wagon creaked beneath her, a slow, rhythmic groan that had become the soundtrack of their journey. Matthew sat beside her, his eyes fixed on the endless stretch of road ahead, where the sun melted into the horizon like spilled ink. His hands, once soft with the privilege of an educated life, were now callous from months of guiding the wagon over rock and dust. "We're close," he murmured, though there was no real measured distance in a land that stretched beyond sight. Rebecca didn't answer. She had learned not to trust his optimism. He had promised her they would be safe by now, that they would reach their new home before the first snow, that the war had taken enough from them. But promises were fragile things, and she had seen too many break. The Oregon Trail had not been kind. The days were grueling, the nights colder than she expected. Some mornings, she woke to frost coating the inside of the wagon, Matthew's arm wrapped tightly around her as if trying to shield her from the very air itself. They had left everything behind for this. Family, security, the ghosts of the past. But the land did not care. It swallowed people whole and did not weep for them. Ahead, the trail narrowed, forcing them between towering rock formations that cast long, skeletal shadows across the road. Rebecca shivered. Something about the silence unsettled her. A distant flicker of movement caught her eye. On the ridge above, dark figures on horseback stood against the fading light, watching. Matthew saw them too. His grip on the reins tightened, his posture stiffening. "Keep your eyes forward," he said, his voice even but low. "Don't stop." Rebecca obeyed, though the weight of unseen eyes pressed against her back. They rode in silence, the tension between them thick enough to smother the air. The figures did not follow. They did not call out. They only watched. When they finally crested the next hill, the sight of the trading post in the valley below brought a breath of relief Rebecca hadn't realized she was holding. It was small, little more than a collection of wooden buildings clustered together, like animals bracing against the wind. A handful of other wagons were scattered outside, their owners tending to their weary horses. Smoke curled from a chimney. The scent of burning would carry it on the wind. It wasn't much, but it was a place to rest, a place to resupply. They needed that. As they rolled into the settlement, Rebecca took in the faces of those around her. Weathered men with sun-scorched skin leaned against their wagons, their expressions unreadable. Women moved in and out of buildings, their eyes wary, their children clinging close to their skirts. Near the far edge of the post, a group of Cheyenne sat gathered around a low fire. They were quiet, their movements slow and deliberate. Rebecca had never been this close to them before. She had heard stories, whispers of raids, of blood spilled on lonely trails, of settlers disappearing into the night. But as she watched them, she saw no malice in their faces, only patience. Matthew stepped down from the wagon and offered his hand to her. She hesitated before taking it, her boots hitting the dry earth. Inside the trading post, the warmth of the fire did little to chase away the tension in the air. The wooden walls were lined with barrels and sacks of grain, shelves stocked with supplies priced too high for most to afford. The scent of tobacco and sweat thickened the air, and every conversation seemed to stop the moment they entered. Men leaned against the bar, their voices low, their glances sharp. The barkeep, a heavy-set man with a grizzled beard, barely looked up as Matthew approached. "We need supplies," Matthew said, pulling a few coins from his coat. "Flour, salt, maybe some dried meat." The barkeep took the money without a word and disappeared into the back. Rebecca shifted uneasily, her fingers tightening around the fabric of her dress. She could feel the stares on her, men measuring, calculating. From the corner of the room, a voice rose, slurred and thick with whiskey. "Shouldn't be here." The room went still. A man at the bar turned, his eyes bloodshot, his mouth curling into something that might have once been a smile. "Indians," he spat, "watching from their camp like damn vultures. Ain't right." Rebecca felt her pulse quicken. Another man, younger but just as warm by the land, exhaled sharply. "They ain't done nothing." Yet the first man countered, pushing himself up from his stool. His gaze flickered toward the window, where the distant figures of the Cheyenne were still visible. "This is settler land. Ain't no place for them here." Matthew took a step forward. "We don't want trouble." The man's attention snapped to him, and his grin widened. "Then you best keep your mouth shut." A hand brushed against Rebecca's arm, so quick she almost missed it. She turned, locking eyes with an older woman near the doorway. The woman's face was lined with years of hardship, but her grip was firm. A warning. "Come," the woman whispered, barely audible over the tension in the room. "Take your things and go." But it was already too late. The scrape of a chair against the wooden floor, the metallic click of a rifle being cocked. "Get out of here," a voice barked. A man near the door had drawn his weapon, aiming at something just beyond the threshold. Rebecca turned just in time to see a Cheyenne man standing there, his hands raised, his face unreadable. Time stretched then, a single breath of silence before the storm. Then the first shot rang out. The room exploded into chaos. Gunfire, shouts, the acrid stench of smoke and sweat. Rebecca ducked as the first bullet shattered a whiskey bottle near her head, glass raining onto the floor. Matthew reached for her, his face contorted with fear, but before he could close the distance, the second shot struck him. He staggered, his breath escaping in a sharp gasp. Rebecca screamed. Matthew fell. The world blurred around her. The walls, the gunfire, the men shouting. All of it faded into a dull roar. She dropped to her knees, hands grasping at him, at the warmth rapidly leaving his body. His eyes met hers, and for a fleeting moment there was nothing but silence between them. Then his breath hitched, and he was gone. A hand grabbed her wrist, pulling her away as bullets ripped through the walls. The trading post had become a war zone. Somewhere in the distance, the sound of hoofbeats thundered against the earth. Rebecca couldn't move. She couldn't breathe. Matthew was dead. The war had taken him after all. The world had turned to silence. The crack of gunfire, the splintering of wood, the shouts of men, faded into a distant hum, swallowed by the wind. Rebecca knelt beside Matthew's body, unable to move, unable to think. Blood soaked through the fabric of his coat, pooling beneath him, dark and final. She traced her fingers over his cheek, his skin already losing its warmth. His eyes, once so bright with dreams, were empty now, fixed on something beyond her reach. A rough hand yanked her backward. She gasped, her vision snapping back into focus. Smoke curled through the air, the scent of burning wood, and gunpowder choking her lungs. Around her, men fought, some scrambling for the doors, others firing wildly into the growing chaos. A Cheyenne man stood near the entrance, his hand still raised, his face unreadable. Someone struck him hard across the face with the butt of a rifle. He staggered, blood trailing from his mouth. Rebecca's breath came in sharp gasps. She had to move. She had to leave. A body slammed against her, knocking her sideways. The weight of the moment shattered. Her limbs, frozen by grief, jolted into action. She scrambled backward, slipping on the blood-slicked floor, her skirts tangling around her legs. The door. She had to get to the door. She didn't look back. Couldn't. The walls of the trading post blurred as she pushed forward, weaving through the chaos, her pulse pounding against her ribs. A man lunged for her. His face was familiar, one of the men from Bar, his mouth twisted in a snarl. She ducked, felt the rush of air as his fingers grasped for her shawl. And then she was outside. The cold night air hit her like a slap. The ground beneath her was hard, frozen in patches where the frost had settled early. The sky stretched wide, the stars distant and indifferent. Run. She had no direction, no plan, only the instinct to flee. Her boots pounded against the dirt as she darted between wagons, past terrified settlers scrambling for cover. Somewhere a woman screamed. Hoofbeats thundered in the distance, the sound reverberating through the valley. She didn't stop. The trees loomed ahead, their skeletal branches reaching for the sky. The moment she crossed into the forest, the sounds of the trading post faded behind her, swallowed by the vastness of the wilderness. She ran until her lungs burned, until her legs gave out beneath her. She collapsed against the trunk of a tree, her chest rising and falling in ragged gasps. The night pressing around her, thick with the scent of pine and damp earth. She pulled her shawl tight around her shoulders, her fingers trembling as she wiped at her face. Matthew was gone. The realization struck her with the force of a physical blow. They had been heading west together, their dreams woven into the fabric of the journey. He had promised her safety, a future, and now he was just another body left behind in the dust. A sob caught her throat, but she swallowed it down. There was no time for grief. Not here. Somewhere in the distance, a branch snapped, her body tensed, her breath hitching. She pressed herself against the tree, listening. The wind whistled through the branches, but beneath it, something else. Movement. She wasn't alone. Slowly, she reached for the small knife hidden in her skirts. It wasn't much, barely sharp enough to cut through rope, but it was all she had. Another rustle. Closer this time. Her fingers tightened around the handle. And then she saw him. A figure slumped against a tree a few yards away, half hidden in the shadows. Moonlight filtered through the branches, casting a faint glow over him. Blood stained the ground beneath him. For a moment, all she could do was stare. The man was Cheyenne. His chest rose and fell in uneven breaths. His hand pressed weakly to his side, where dark crimson seeped through his clothing. She should leave. Every instinct screamed at her to turn, to run deeper into the forest, to put as much distance between herself and him as possible. But she didn't move. She had seen him before, at the trading post. He had been standing in the doorway when the shot was fired, his hands raised, unarmed. He hadn't attacked anyone. He hadn't fought back. And now he was dying. Her grip on the knife loosened. Carefully, she took a step forward. Then another. His eyes flooded open, dark and unfocused. For a moment, they just looked at each other. He said something, his voice low, the words foreign to her ears. She didn't understand, but the tone, it wasn't threatening. It was pleading. Rebecca hesitated only a moment longer before kneeling beside him. His breath came in sharp, shallow bursts, his jaw tight with pain. Blood pooled around his waist where the bullet had torn through him. She had no medicine, no proper bandages, only the clothes on her back. Swallowing hard, she tore a strip from her petticoat, the fabric fraying beneath her fingers. He tensed as she pressed it against the wound, his body going rigid. "You're losing too much blood," she murmured, as if he could understand. His gaze flickered over her face, his breathing unsteady. She wrapped the makeshift bandage around him as tightly as she could. His skin was feverish beneath her touch, sweat dampening his brow. He was in bad shape. If infection set in, a sound in the distance made her freeze. Hoofbeats. Panic surged through her veins. Someone was coming. She turned back to him. His strength was fading, his head tilting slightly as he fought to stay conscious. She had a choice. Leave him, save herself, or take him with her. The wind shifted, carrying the distant echoes of voices. Rebecca clenched her jaw. She hadn't saved him just to let him die now. Bracing herself, she hooked her arms under his, gritting her teeth as she pulled him upright. He let out a low, pained groan but didn't fight her. "We have to move," she whispered. She wasn't sure if he understood, but he didn't resist as she half-dragged, half-carried him deeper into the trees. The hoofbeats grew louder. The wilderness swallowed them whole. The night stretched on, cold and merciless, as Rebecca pressed forward through thick underbrush, the weight of the wounded man pulling at her shoulders. His breaths came ragged, uneven, each step a battle against the pain searing through his body. His blood had already soaked through the makeshift bandage she had tied around his waist, staining her hands, but there was no time to stop. Behind them, the distant sound of hoofbeats still echoed through the trees, a grim reminder that danger was never far. She didn't know where she was going, only that she had to keep moving. The forest was dense, the path ahead swallowed in darkness. But she forced her feet forward, her mind numb with exhaustion. The man, his strength nearly spent, slumped against her, his weight dragging heavier with each step. He murmured something in his language. The words lost a wind, but the tone was unmistakable. He was slipping. A clearing appeared ahead, a break in the endless trees. There, nestled against the roots of an ancient oak, was a small overhang of rock. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. With the last of her strength, she eased him down onto the cold earth, his body shuddering from the effort. His breathing was shallow, his face pale, but he was alive. Rebecca collapsed beside him, her chest rising and falling in sharp, desperate gulps of air. Her limbs trembled from exhaustion, but she couldn't rest yet. Reaching into the satchel slung across her shoulder, she pulled out the last of their water and held it to his lips. He didn't move at first, his eyes half-lidded, but after a moment he swallowed, his throat working weakly. She exhaled in relief. At least he was still fighting. The night was cruel, the wind biting through her thin shawl as she huddled beside him. Every few moments his body jerked, his muscles tensing from the pain in his side. She pressed a hand against his forehead. Too warm. Fever was setting in. Her heart pounded as she looked around, searching for anything that could help. The forest was vast, but it offered little in the way of comfort. Somewhere in the distance an owl called. Its voice a lonely echo through the trees. She needed fire, warmth. Tearing the hem of her skirt, she bundled the fabric into a rough pile and struck flint against stone. Sparks flared, catching in the dry leaves, and slowly the flames came to life. The light cast long shadows against the trees, flickering against the contours of the man's face. He was younger than she had realized, though his eyes, when they briefly opened, held years of knowledge and hardship. She watched him for a long moment, her thoughts tangled between exhaustion and grief. He was supposed to be the enemy. That was what she had been told. But the enemy didn't bleed the same way, didn't suffer the same. The enemy didn't look at her the way he did, calm, unreadable, yet entirely aware. As the fire crackled, she murmured, "Who are you?" His gaze flickered to hers. For a moment, he said nothing. Then, after what felt like an eternity, he rasped a single word, "Hawkeye." His voice was low, rough with pain. She let the name settle between them before nodding. It suited him, sharp, watchful. She hesitated before pressing a hand lightly against his bandaged side. His body tensed, but he didn't flinch away. "You need better medicine than I have," she said, not sure if he could understand her. "I don't know how to help you." Hawkeye closed his eyes briefly, as if weighing his options, then lifted a weak hand, pointing past the trees. There was something there, something he wasn't strong enough to reach on his own. She exhaled, rubbing her hands over her chilled arms. The thought of wandering deeper into the unknown alone sent a prickle of unease through her spine. But what choice did she have? If she left him like this, he wouldn't survive the night. "I'll go," she said, pushing to her feet. "But you better not be dead when I get back." Hawkeye said nothing, but the corner of his mouth twitched, just slightly. She turned, slipping into the forest, the firelight fading behind her. The woods were different in the dark, deeper, hungrier. Each rustling branch felt like watching eyes, every gust of wind a whisper of something unseen. But she moved with purpose, scanning the ground for any sign of what he had meant. Minutes stretched into an eternity before she found it. Nestled beneath a fallen tree was a small bundle of wrapped herbs, tucked carefully away from sight. Someone had placed it here, hidden it. She didn't know if it was meant for him or another, but it didn't matter. She took it and turned back. When she reached the fire, Hawkeye's eyes were barely open, his breathing more labored. The fever had worsened in her absence. Kneeling beside him, she unwrapped the herbs and hesitated. She had no idea what they were, but something in her gut told her to trust him. Carefully, she pressed the leaves into a small bowl of water and crushed them into a thick paste. She looked at him once more. This might hurt. His lips barely moved, but she thought she saw the trace of a smirk. She pressed the mixture against his wound. He jerked, his teeth gritted, but he didn't cry out. Minutes passed. His breathing steadied. The fire crackled between them. She sat back, exhaustion pulling at her bones. But for the first time since the trading post, she didn't feel entirely alone. The days stretched into a rhythm. She hunted what little she could, setting traps for rabbits, gathering what edible plants she could find. Hawkeye grew stronger, though he spoke little. At first, their words were few. His English was broken, her Cheyenne non-existent. But language wasn't always needed. She learned his expressions, the way his eyes flickered with amusement when she stumbled to the woods, the way his jaw tightened when his wound pained him. He was patient, watching her with something that felt more like quiet curiosity than suspicion. One afternoon, as they walked along the river, she lost her footing on the slick rocks. The cold water dragged her under, ice slipping into her veins. Panic seized her. She couldn't find the surface. Then, strong hands grasped her wrist. She was pulled up, gasping, water streaming from her hair. She clung to the riverbank, coughing, shivering. Hawkeye knelt beside her. He didn't speak. He simply tapped his chest. "Strong," he said. She looked at him, breathless, and then, for the first time in weeks, she laughed. It was small, barely more than a breath, but real. Hawkeye's lips twitched. They weren't friends. Not yet, but they were something. That night, as the fire burned low, she caught him watching her. His gaze was unreadable, but it held something she hadn't seen in a long time. Recognition, not of what they were, but of what they could become. The wind shifted, carried with it the scent of smoke and something else. Something sharper, more dangerous. Rebecca paused, fingers tightening around the small knife at her belt, her breath forming thin clouds in the cold air. Hawkeye had stopped beside her, his body tense, listening. He had heard it too, a sound just beneath the rustling of the trees. Footsteps. Her pulse quickened. They had been careful, moving through the wilderness with purpose but never haste, avoiding open spaces, making camp in places where the land itself concealed them. But someone had found them, or had been following them all along. Hawkeye raised a hand, the signal for silence. A twig snapped. Rebecca barely had time to react before a voice, gruff and laced with amusement, cut through the stillness. Well, the man drawled. Look what we have here. The first figure stepped into the moonlight, a rifle resting casually over his shoulder. His face was rough, sun-scorched, with a jagged scar running down his cheek. Two others followed behind him, their eyes hungry, movements slow and deliberate, like wolves circling their prey. Bandits. Rebecca's stomach clenched. These weren't just desperate men looking for food. These were scavengers, predators who thrived on the weak and the lost. And they had just cornered their next meal. Hawkeye didn't move. His expression was unreadable. But Rebecca saw the way his fingers drifted toward the bow slung across his back, the way his body coiled like a spring, ready to strike. The leader smiled, his teeth yellow in the dim light. "Didn't think we'd catch up to you so soon," he said. His gaze flicked to Rebecca, slow and calculating. "We saw you back at the trading post, girl. Thought you'd be long dead by now." She swallowed the fear clawing its way up her throat. "We have nothing worth taking," she said, forcing her voice to stay even. The leader chuckled. "See, that's where you're wrong." Rebecca's grip on her knife tightened. One of the men shifted forward, reaching for her. Hawkeye moved first. It happened in the space of a breath. His hand flashed his bow, an arrow loose before the bandit even realized what was happening. The man jerked back with a strangled cry, clutching his shoulder where the arrow had buried itself deep. Then the world exploded into motion. Rebecca ducked as the leader swung his rifle toward Hawkeye, the crack of gunfire splitting the night. She lunged forward, the knife in her hand finding flesh, dragging across the man's arm. He roared in pain, backhanding her so hard she stumbled, her vision flashing white. Hawkeye was already moving, a second arrow drawn, and loose before the leader could recover. It struck him in the leg, sending him sprawling onto the ground with a snarl. The remaining bandit hesitated, his gun wavering. He looked at the scene before him, at his wounded companions, and Rebecca saw it. The flicker of doubt, the recognition that this wasn't the easy fight he had expected. "Go!" she breathed, voice shaking with adrenaline. The man hesitated a moment longer. Then he turned and ran, crashing through the underbrush in blind panic. Silence settled over the clearing. The leader, still on the ground, let out a low, wheezing laugh. "You should have let me kill you quick, girl," he muttered, his voice thick with venom. "Ain't no life waiting for you out here. Just more death." Rebecca stepped closer, her breath unsteady. She could still feel the sting where he had hit her, still taste the copper tang of blood in her mouth. She looked down at him, at the man who had thought he could decide her fate. "I survived worse," she said, and she turned away. Hawkeye watched her, his expression unreadable, then stepped past her. He knelt by the bandit, gripping the man's collar in one strong hand. For a moment, he said nothing. Then, in a voice low and calm, he murmured something in his own language. Whatever it was, the bandit's sneer faltered. Hawkeye released him with a shove, and the man scrambled away, limping into the darkness. Rebecca exhaled, her body trembling from the aftermath. She turned toward Hawkeye, her voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you." He studied her for a moment, then gave a single nod. The journey didn't end that night. They traveled for days, pushing forward through bitter cold and harsh winds, their bond now forged in blood and survival. But the closer they got to civilization, the heavier Rebecca's heart became. She had always known this wasn't forever. The town appeared in the distance one morning, a collection of wooden buildings standing defiantly against the wilderness. Smoke curled from chimneys, the distant sound of hammers against wood ringing through the crisp air. A new beginning. She turned to Hawkeye. He stood still, watching her, his expression calm but knowing. This was where they parted ways. I don't want to leave, she admitted, her throat tightening. For the first time, his lips twitched, not quite a smile, but something close. He stepped forward, placing his hand over her heart, then his own, a silent promise. She understood. She had thought strength meant surviving alone, but she had learned something greater. Strength was trust. Strength was knowing when to fight and when to walk away. Strength was allowing someone in, even when the world told you not to. The town waited. A new life, a chance to rebuild. She took a deep breath and walked forward,